So we're reframing that term, junkie.
We are.
That's a good thing.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah.
All right.
It's got a sting to it.
Let's get started. So today's guest is Mike Bosworth, and Mike is an author, a speaker, the owner of his own company, Mike Bosworth Leadership. There's probably a list of 50 ways I could introduce Mike because he's done a lot of really cool things. But hi, Mike.
Hi, Nick. 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover. Wasn't that a song or something like that?
I'm not sure.
That's where I went with the 50
That's beyond
ways.
our age.
Okay.
Yeah, it makes me old. Yeah, okay.
All right. Well, so Mike, let's, if you don't mind, kind of start out from the beginning. Where are you from? What was your childhood like? And we'll kind of just keep building from there.
All right. Well, I was born in St. Paul, Minnesota in 1947 to a Irish Catholic mother who thought she'd go to hell if she used birth control. And, of course, you'd go to hell if you ever got divorced. And so she ended up staying with my violent alcoholic father and having 5 children with him, none of which he wanted. And so it wasn't fun. He couldn't keep a job. And then, my mother died when I was 18 and the youngest was 9. And after a really hellacious year with some just terrible things that I only tell my close friends, my younger siblings all got farmed out to relatives, and I had 1 year at Mount San Antonio Junior College where I remember that my first week of college, 2 things happened. One, my mother died, and the second thing is I dropped out of speech class because I got sick to my stomach with the thought of having to get up in front of people and talk. And here I am today, right? So with that, up until those first 19 years were pretty much sucked, and I knew at 8 that if my dad was this guy, I'm going the opposite direction. At 8 years old, he became my anti-model. So anyway, so I had no mentors, and I was very mediocre in high school. Just the home life was so bad that, none of us were doing that well in school. So there wasn't even any talk of college in my house. And so then, my sister, who always guided me, said, you got to go to college. And so I enrolled in Mount Sac, and, with no vision or anything, I took a couple of science courses that were kind of fun, and that speech class scared the hell out of me, so I got the hell out of that. But at the end of the year, I was a mediocre student at Mount San Antonio Junior College, and so back then you could volunteer for the draft and only have to spend 2 years in the Army instead of 3.
And this was in the 60s?
This was 1966.
Okay.
Yeah. I graduated in high school in 65, so this is November of 66, I went in the Army.
Okay.
And I hated it, but I did pretty well at it. The best skill you could possibly have going into the Army is knowing how to type. And the one class I did take at Mount San Antonio Junior College that probably saved my ass was learning to type.
Really?
Yeah, because after basic training in truck driver school, they sent me to truck driver school. But after that, I'm at a artillery battery up in Fayetteville, North Carolina. This guy comes in and says, any of you guys know how to type? I raise my hand. Boom, I'm the company clerk. And
that's awesome.
Is this okay to talk about this level of stuff?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah,
All right. All right.
Thank you.
And so this guy, Lieutenant Satterbro or something like that, he's a Southern guy, and he was a short-timer. He was getting out in 90 days. And so my first meeting with him that first morning, he says, Bosworth, I want to spend as little time here every day as possible. I want to come in from 8 to 8:30 in the morning, and I'm going to come in from 4 to 4:30 in the afternoon. Anything that needs signing, have it on my desk.
Nice.
So he kind of handed me the keys to the kingdom, right?
Yeah.
So I got my shoe shined and my bed made, and, being the company clerk was, especially with a guy who didn't want to be there, was just kind of abdicated, all this daily stuff, duty rosters and all that stuff to me. And so, and then something really fantastic happened. I guess another thing about Mount San Antonio College, I did join their glee club, their men's glee club, and
what's a glee club?
A singing group.
Oh, nice.
Yeah,
very cool.
Yeah, I'm glad you didn't go to the show Glee when I said Glee Club. I was a little nervous about that.
Yeah, we have a younger audience, so I just wanted to.
Yeah. So anyway, so that was kind of fun because I'd never had any music lessons, but I had relatives that had musical talent, so I enjoyed singing. And
Sure.
So then I'm in the Army now, in North Carolina, and the 3rd Army Men's Glee Club comes on base to entertain us. And I go, dude, those guys are going through the Army the right way. They get to go from city to city. The Army buys them a tuxedo, and they dress them up and take them around the world, and they're the show. You know, you go to Thailand, and any place there's an Army base, 142 countries, right?
Right.
I'm thinking, boy, this is for me. Can you relate? So, I auditioned and I made it, and I'm set to go. And a week before I get on the airplane, I got name levied to Vietnam, and it superseded everything.
Wow.
It was over. So that whole deal, that huge vision was poof. Poof. It was a great vision, though. I can still think back about and kind of fantasize on how good that would have been.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I get named levied to Vietnam, and Vietnam was really scary back then, at least to guys like me.
What was your initial feeling or thoughts when you first got there as you're flying in?
Oh, well, I think back then the Army had so many people going over there. I think we had 500,000 people at one time over there.
Wow.
So there were so many people going over that the U.S. Army commissioned all the commercial airlines to fly the GIs over. So I think I went over in Braniff and I came back in TWA. But I remember first, we couldn't, it's so far away that we had to stop in the Philippines to refuel. The jets wouldn't even make it from California to Vietnam nonstop. So there had to be a stop, and we got off the airplane in Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines, and I'd never felt anything so hot and sticky, and it was scary. It was so humid and hot and oppressive. It was like 100 and 100. Is
that worse than the Carolinas?
It's worse than even Florida in the summertime. It's worse than Houston. It's worse than New Orleans. It's worse than all of them. It's awful. So
sounds pretty shitty.
I know. So now we get the next leg of the flight thinking about being in that for the next year or 12 months, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's not fun. And then we're all scared shitless. And as we start to land into Vietnam, the pilot says, well, gentlemen, it looks partly cloudy with moderate to heavy ground fire. And just to mess with all of us, right? So anyway,
like it's a part of the weather.
Yeah, and so I was never so scared in my life. Well, that's not exactly true. That actually was a lie.
Okay.
Because
appreciate your
after Vietnam, years later, my brother Steve and I both remarked that we neither one of us ever had a night in Vietnam that was as scary as being with my dad when he was on the rampage.
Really?
Yeah. So it was like we were preconditioned to not get PTSD from Vietnam because we'd already had the training,
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Wow, all right.
So anyway, I don't know how much to go into the Vietnam. Do you want me to go into the...
well, we can, there's a lot of other stuff I want to talk about. So
I could just net out the Vietnam trip that I got through it pretty good shape. I ended up getting another personnel-type job.
Very cool.
And ended up running a computer system over there, the officer inventory system for Vietnam. Huh. And that got me to think about going into computers. And so when I was about to leave Vietnam, I wrote IBM a letter, and I said, here I am, I've got this experience, I'm ready to go. And they wrote me back and said, well, we think you should go to college first. Jeez. And so, I started thinking about that. And then I got back, and my sister got me enrolled in Cal Poly Pomona. And I had a blast going to Cal Poly Pomona.
Really?
I might not have learned much about business, but I sure had a good time. My sister was the president.
We can relate to that.
My sister was the president of the largest sorority on campus. And parties and stuff, and my brother and I, we didn't have to join a fraternity to get invited to those parties, because there was no way I'm going to do a fraternity after 13 months in Vietnam.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
It's just not going to happen.
I can't imagine. I know how fun it is to go to college, but to go to college after getting out of being drafted in a war like Vietnam, it must be just the most fun, coolest thing ever.
Well, I tell you, though, there were turbulent times back then. Remember the college students getting killed at Kent State?
Yeah.
It was bad stuff. And I was only in Vietnam about a week before I realized this is a huge mistake. This is a travesty. We have no business being here. We're napalming, women and children. Well, you talk about atrocities, right? How about us?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sad stuff.
Yeah, sad stuff. But
and so you got into college and you're having a good time, and I'm assuming at some point you graduated, or what led you to eventually get into sales?
Well, while I was in college, I had the GI Bill, but I still needed to work, and I got a nighttime computer operations job with a big retailer, and so every Friday, Saturday night, I'm in this big computer room running jobs, and then I majored in marketing, with an business admin minor, and so by the time I was ready to get out of college, I had some good hands-on computer experience in the Army, and working for the big retailer, and I had a business major. And Xerox Computer Services came on campus and did on-campus interviewing, and that's where I discovered them and found them. And once I found them, I turned down other jobs because that's the company I wanted to work for. I just knew it. Mm-hmm. And I was pretty much camping on their doorstep for about 3 months after that interview, saying, I want to work for you guys. I don't want to work for Burroughs. I want to work here. And finally, I got a job offer, but they gave me the shittiest job in the company, which was at the help desk.
Right.
Yeah, so I did a year in the help desk.
Is that like a call center?
Yeah, we actually had a red telephone, and
actually red.
It was ruby red, and most people don't know it. Well, most people have heard that Xerox has invented more cool technology they haven't made money on than any company in the history of the world. The whole desktop interface that you're looking at right now with the mouse and the window and the icons and all that stuff, I had a demo at Xerox in 1976 of that.
Really?
Yeah, I'd heard the mouse came from Xerox originally.
Yeah. And, the whole concept of the icons and clicking on it and all that was Xerox. They never made a penny off of it. But one day they let Steve Jobs have a tour of their research center. And
yeah.
No way. I didn't know that.
Yeah. So Xerox invented the Ethernet. They never made any money with that. And they also invented cloud computing, and nobody knows that. But basically, in 1969, Xerox had a full set of pre-developed business applications for accounts payable, accounts receivable, general ledger, inventory, manufacturing, planning, all that stuff. And it was done with a central computer in Marina del Rey, California, and initially only local customers in Los Angeles hooked up to that computer with phone lines and dumb terminals all these different job titles are now on a computer, kind of like you're on your little laptop every day, right, doing their accounts payable or their general ledger or their material planning or their payroll or their benefits, processing all that stuff in our system. And they had to pay for usage, there was no fee. So if they weren't using it, there was no revenue. So everybody in the company was focused on helping them run their businesses so much better with our stuff than they ever were able to without it. That's what we were growing the company with, and it was a blast. So a year in the help desk, 2.5 years out in the field, then as a field installer, getting to implement these manufacturing systems.
Right.
And then after 2.5 years, the local sales manager says, well, Mike, we want you to be a salesman. And I had two answers to that, no and hell no. One.
And why was that?
Well, for reason one was my old man was a salesman, and the last thing I wanted to do was be anything like him. Mm-hmm. And the second reason was for those 2.5 years that I've been taking care of customers, all of them had promises made to them by salesmen about stuff that or capabilities that our product had that they didn't.
And then you had to clean up.
And then we had to clean up the mess, because they were selling vaporware or fantasyware. You know, a buyer would say, "Well, will it do this?" And they'll go, "Oh yeah, sure, no problem, it'll do that."
Right.
Yeah. So, my opinion of them as a profession was pretty low, having had to clean up their messes for really 2.5 years.
Sure. So what persuaded you?
Well, they came back a week later and they said, "All right, we know you're reluctant. We want you to try it for 6 months. And at the end of 6 months, if you hate it, you can have your old job back. We'll give it to you in writing. And during that 6-month trial period, you can keep your techie salary. You don't have to go down to the salesman base. And if you sell anything on top of that, it's gravy." And so I decided to give it a go. Now, they weren't worried about paying me too much money back then because it was typically taking 7 to 9 months for any newly hired salesperson from IBM to come in and make their first sale there because of the complicated product. Think about that, Sure. All those applications in 3-ring binders, user manuals and stuff. So, but that complicated product being sold by salespeople is really one of the that caused me to build one of the foundations of my sales methodologies, because I went through the same product training when I joined Xerox that all the salesmen did. Most of the people in my class were salesmen from IBM that decided to join Xerox, and they were going through the same product training, 6 weeks. Mm-hmm. And to graduate from that, you had to give a demo. You had to demo each application. You had to demo watching a journal entry, a debit and a credit. Boy, that was exciting, right?
Thrilling.
Or putting a quantity of 1,000 into your inventory, or taking stuff out of inventory, some of the manufacturing planning stuff. Now that started to get pretty wild and cool, but the basic accounting stuff was,
So you'd go through this training, and then you'd have to present the product to your managers.
Right, in order to graduate from product school. And nobody could make a sales call until they graduated from product school. So these guys would go out after 6 weeks of product training and say, "Hey, I used to work for IBM, and now I'm working for Xerox. Can I show you a demo?" And they're just leading with the product. And, when I went into sales, because of my 2.5 years, I counted up. Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book about, in one of his books about mastery, 10,000 hours to be a master of something. Yeah. And I counted up, I had almost 8,000 hours of helping customers by job title: controller, accounts payable, accounts receivable, material control, payroll, production control. I had doing the before and after on them. I knew how they used to do their job every day without my product, and I knew what they could do with it.
Sure.
So.
And what age were you now?
28.
28.
28. So.
So you were on the inside at first, customer service, helping people that are having issues, problems,
Yep.
And then you went on the opposite side. I mean, initially, almost causing the problems, or the original sales guys.
Oh yeah, because
you're on the dark side.
Yeah, they were saying. As a matter of fact, this was funny. When Xerox gave me my new business cards that said salesman on it, I was shocked when I gave it to people, and I could feel their yuck reaction. And so I have a confession to make on this show.
Okay.
Please.
It took me about 4 days to discover that those cards were causing people to repel. So I kept my techie cards. Whenever I made a sales call, I gave my techie card out, and then they were happy to see me.
Wow. Because they didn't feel threatened.
They didn't feel like somebody's going to come and sell them something. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Because as a techie, every time I went out to a customer, they were happy to see me. "Mike, God, I'm glad you're here. This is screwed up. Help us get this fixed," right?
Right.
Yeah. I mean, that's a fun job.
Yeah.
Helping people, get stuff figured out like that.
So how long did it take for you to start having fun and enjoying it? Man, you're reluctant at first.
About a week.
There you go.
Well, here's it. And the best hindsights are 2020, right? Because now I know, in 2013, I can describe to you why I did so well when I was 28.
Okay.
But when I was 28, I was just following my intuition.
Right.
All right. So here was what my intuition led me to. The one thing I had no clue how to do is cold call, right, going into sales. And so my manager's this ex-IBMer, and he says, well, I'm going to teach you to cold call. And back then, cold calling wasn't dialing for dollars. It was walking into lobbies in industrial parks and saying hi to the receptionist. We're from Xerox. We'd like to speak with your controller, or we'd like to speak with your materials manager. And back then, Xerox had such a halo around it as just a cool company that it worked. People, they came out to the lobby to talk to the guy from Xerox.
Right.
I mean, how cool is that, right? And so I think it was a gut instinct thing, but I'm 28. They're all in their 40s and 50s, right? Now, I knew in about 4 seconds, once they started talking to me, of exactly what was wrong with their production, why it was screwed up, and how, if they had my product, they could clean that mess up pronto.
Right.
Right? But how would a typical 40 or 50-year-old react to a snot-nosed 28-year-old who says, here, this is what you need to do to clean your shop up?
Reluctantly.
Yeah.
Right?
He wouldn't like it.
No one would like it.
But I think you might be intrigued. I mean, you said yourself Xerox was a cool company.
I know, and I wasn't the only one making sales.
Yeah.
But I ended up selling more in my first 5 months on quota than anybody in the history of the company had sold in a full year.
Wow.
Okay?
Impressive.
So it was just way, it just ramped right up. Right up. And the reason it ramped right up, you want the 20/20 hindsight?
Yeah, and you mentioned, too, you asked why wouldn't someone who's 50 like a 28-year-old
Telling them what they need to do.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Well, as a matter of fact, my first wife told me what I needed to do a whole bunch in that 26 years before I divorced her. I mean, we have an exercise in our workshops, and we'll say, how many of you in a long-term relationship, and people raise their hands, they say, next break, go out and call that person, the person who in theory loves you more than anybody else in the whole world, and try 2 to 3 you need tos on them and see how they react.
Right. Not well.
Not well. No, nobody. You think teenagers like their
Negatively.
parents saying, Nick, you need to do this, and nobody likes to be told what they need to do.
Sure.
And back then, though, I think it was the age discrepancy, the gap between me being 28 and them being in their 40s and 50s, that I knew back then at my age, I wouldn't tell anybody in their 40s and 50s what they needed to do about anything, right?
Right.
I wouldn't do it. I couldn't do it.
Were the older salesmen, they felt comfortable doing that?
Well, one, they felt comfortable telling people what they need to do. Of course, the second thing is they didn't really know what they needed to do because all they knew how to do was to demo the product.
Right.
The other salesmen did not get all those job titles and how their job used to suck without our product and how on a daily or hourly basis, they're doing things better. They're seeing more visibility. They're making more decisions. They're taking advantage of more discounts. They're cutting their expenses in their manufacturing. They're reducing their inventory. They're increasing the percentage of orders fulfilled. All this stuff, all these business variables. It was amazing. But none of the regularly trained salespeople knew that stuff.
Right.
Because they couldn't.
And you started to see this as you got into the role.
Well, so let me go back to those first cold calls. Literally my first cold call. Walk into a lobby. Hi, I'm with Xerox. I'd like to talk to your materials manager. He came out. First cold call. And so instinctively I said, hi, my name is Mike Bosworth, and I'm with Xerox Computer Services, and we've been working with some other assembly manufacturing companies down here in Orange County. Can I share with you a quick story about a materials manager less than a mile from here who's been able to almost eliminate shortages and lowers inventory at the same time?
Yes.
He says yes.
Guess how many materials managers I cold called ever said no to that?
How many?
0. They all said yes.
And
All of them.
And why was that? Because you offered a story.
Because I offered a story. But I didn't even get the power of story or what offering them a story really meant until, in the last 5 years.
Sure.
So back then, it's just 20/20 hindsight now.
Right.
I get now why it worked. But
Okay.
back then, you could have offered me $1 million if I could have figured out what I was doing
Sure.
to the way I know it now and codified it.
Okay.
Yeah,
And,
but I couldn't have.
I definitely want to talk about why stories work.
Yeah.
But maybe we can kind of fast track a little bit
Yeah.
through. I remember didn't you get promoted you were doing so well, they made you a sales manager? Or
Oh, yes, and, and my ego caused me to be stupid and take that promotion. But,
And why was that a stupid decision?
well, a number of reasons. But one of them was that they moved me from L.A. to New Jersey. A second reason would be that it took me 5 years in management to get my income back up to what it was as a salesman.
Really?
Yeah. And then I ended up inheriting a bunch of guys. Now I'm 29 now when they promote me to manager and move me, right? I mean, I'm fast tracking, right? And I went from being number one salesman in the company to the number last sales manager in the company. And back then at Xerox, they posted on every bulletin board every month throughout the whole company the whole list of salespeople, top to bottom, and the whole list of managers, top to bottom. If you were a hero, everybody knew it. If you sucked, everybody knew it.
Man, okay.
So, I mean, it was really, the hero to zero thing was really tough for me, being the last ranking sales manager after they promoted me to manager. Because, my sales, that thing took off like a rocket. And when I went into management, it crashed about just as fast.
And why did it crash so fast?
Well, because I guess I was forced to, do a bunch of things as a manager that I hated to do as a salesman, like managing expense reports and mileage stuff and sales forecasts and all that administrivia. That's never been my strong suit. So, one, just keeping track of that kind of gave me hives just to start with. And the second thing is these salesmen I had, they had no clue how our customers could use our products to make money or save money. I have been talking about earlier, they went through the 6 weeks of product training. All they knew how to do was do demos.
Right.
And so that's when I figured out the 9 boxes, which eventually became the basis for my whole solution selling methodology. And what I did is I kind of came up with an artificial intelligence system that I could teach to these salespeople who'd been through 6 weeks of product training.
Right.
So they could promise a solution that would work. Because it had so bothered me for those years that I was cleaning up the messes that I didn't want my own salespeople making those messes. So I had to figure out a way to make them more competent conversationally, but only around a certain set of things. Not the whole world, right? But within, how does a materials manager do his job without our product, and how can he do it with?
Right.
And I wrote these prompters called pain sheets. And basically what they were the diagnostic questions that the smartest person on our company would ask. If our top number one manufacturing consultant, if he were out there, what questions would he be asking that materials manager about his current operation? We wrote those questions out so the salesman could ask the questions. And then we mapped out how the first person's problem is impacting other people in the company. If you've got a shortage problem, Nick, it's causing him to have too much inventory and the carrying costs are too high, and so the profits are
Sorry, Pete.
lower and stuff like that. So it's basically giving them all the finger pointing, right? So arming them with it's kind of making them more human, because they can say it's not all my fault.
Sure.
Or, other people are doing things that are causing me to do that. It's kind of the whole chain of events in companies that nobody in their own cubicle ever thinks about outside their cubicle.
Right.
Right? So we mapped out the out-of-cubicle thinking on the second column, and then on the third column of the artificial intelligence sheet were event-driven questions. So, for instance, you're a materials manager, you're getting ready to go home on Friday afternoon, you got people coming over, and one of your vendors calls up and says, Nick, those 1,500 widgets that we're supposed to be delivering to you on Monday, they're going to be there a week from Monday. Okay? Now, in the old world, that guy wouldn't have gone home all weekend.
Right.
Because he would have been frantically trying to figure out which customers have we already made promises to that we can't deliver on. Because the smartest thing a company can ever do if they had a way to figure that out is call a customer in advance and say, I'm calling to beg your forgiveness.
Right.
We're going to be a week late on our shipment. I'll make it up to you later. That's a lot better than the customer finding out that you didn't deliver and after a day or two calling you up pissed off. Right? So this is just one event, right, in the mind of a materials manager. And so an event-driven vision question or solution question would be, Nick, what if you're at your desk, 5 o'clock or 4:30, 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, getting ready to go home and do a barbecue and entertain, and one of your biggest vendors called you and said, hey, I'm not going to be able to make that delivery. If that happened, what if you could go over to your terminal and in less than 2 minutes get a list of all the customers and their phone numbers and the due date that they think they're getting the order and the new revised date and beg their forgiveness in advance? Would that help you keep your customers happier?
Of course it would.
Yeah. Now,
I think so.
the salespeople didn't know how to do. How were they going to learn how to do that in product school? They weren't.
Right, because they didn't know what that guy's position was
Right,
like.
right. So what solution selling was, and the book came out in 1993. Solution selling was really the world's best product training. With my 20/20 hindsight, back then it was called sales training, but it was really the world's best product training.
And how big did solution selling get? It was a McGraw-Hill book, right?
Oh, the book, yeah. Well, I started the business in 1983 solo, where I wanted to go out because I'd ended up doing Xerox's sales training for my last 6 years with them.
Okay.
So I really got to feel good and like doing sales training. And so in 1983, I started my own sales training business called Solution Selling. I did it solo for 5 years. Then I started adding licensed affiliates, people who would have their own solution selling business, their own solution selling client, using my material. And they paid me a royalty for the use of my material. And I had pretty stringent requirements about how I taught them to teach it. They had to take the course once. They had to coach it 5 times back then. They had to write out a lesson plan. And they had to collect feedback forms. So I never required any upfront money from them because their big investment really was getting good at doing solution selling.
Sure.
And solution selling was a 4-day workshop, and it took a while to really learn how to deliver that. But by the mid-'90s, I had 50 people out there doing solution selling.
Wow.
And the book came out in 1993, 10 years after I started the business, and my affiliates basically pushed me into writing the book. My life was great. I didn't need a book, but they said, Mike, we need a book. We need a book. So one of my affiliates, Ghost, wrote it for me, and I hated it.
Really?
Yeah.
Why'd you hate it?
The tone of it. It was didactic. It was do this and do. It was telling people what they needed to do, which I've never liked doing.
Got it.
Right?
It wasn't you, though.
It wasn't me. So, but because he organized all the material, it only took me 6 months to rewrite it. Because he had chapters and he had topics, and all I had to do was put the thing in my voice.
Yeah.
Right? So that book ended up being the second best-selling business book McGraw-Hill ever had. Number 1 was Spin Selling, Neil Rackham, and yeah. And that business, though, I mean, it wasn't really the book sales. It was the 50 affiliates sending me royalty checks to the
Right.
tune of almost $3 million a year by the late 90s. It was good.
And you guys were training you and or your affiliates were training some pretty big companies, right?
In 1995, we trained 15,000 IBM salespeople.
Wow.
You and your affiliates?
I didn't train one of them. All my affiliates trained all of them. Yeah,
Must have been nice.
I stayed home and went to the mailbox every day.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Huh.
So quick question: your time in college, your time in the military, and your time at Xerox. I mean, where did you get the most education that you really applied?
Oh, at Xerox. I mean, being forced to sit on that help desk for a year and learn every 3-ring binder up on the shelf above me, one for each application, a 3-ring binder for general ledger, payables, receivables, order entry. Having to learn all those job titles at that level enabled me to be able to tell really great stories as a salesman. And the Xerox name would get me to anybody I wanted to get to, right? And I'd tell them a story, and they go, wow, and they'd go into a buy cycle. And I rarely had to close back then. Those people were so excited to have this thing that they'd say to me, Mike, when can we get this thing in? They'd close themselves.
That's great.
It's a dream.
But it was stories.
Right, and that's a perfect transition. So
Yeah.
let's talk about stories. What is it about stories that's so powerful? And how did you kind of come to find that?
All
Even though
right.
you were doing it
Yeah.
intuitively. What was your aha moment?
Well, there's a number of aha moments, and they all happened in 2008. The first aha moment was, and this was a very painful aha moment for me, was when I was still with customer-centric selling, and we had our annual affiliate meeting, and we were a business similar to solution selling.
Okay, so customer-centric kind of stemmed from solution?
It
Was
did.
another-
It was basically with customer-centric selling, we were trying to make it simpler because the version that I wrote originally for information technology companies took into account how complicated their products were.
Right.
That level of complexity was freaking out companies that didn't have complex products.
Got it. Okay.
And so we had to come out with a way that was more generic than just B2B information technology companies. And that was the goal with customer-centric selling.
Okay.
And so there we changed to targeted conversation lists, which is if you're a salesperson, what vertical markets are you selling into? Now this is assuming we're selling something complicated where the seller knows more than the buyer. 90% of the companies that have ever done business with me are selling either advice or technology or software, and their knowledge of their customer's situation far exceeds the customer's knowledge. Just like when I was out selling those manufacturing systems, my knowledge far exceeded the knowledge of the guys I'm selling to.
Sure.
But the two problems in that kind of a business are, one, you can't just teach your salespeople how to give demos because it's not helping them. They need to be able to have intelligent conversations with targeted situations.
Right.
Right. And so ended up with the same kind of world's best product training, only it was 2 columns, diagnostic questions on the right and capability questions. I mean, diagnostic questions on the left and capability questions on the right. But that's neither here nor there. My mission when I started solution selling in 1983 was to help the bottom 80% of the salespeople who are only selling 20% of the revenue. Because what drove Xerox to hire Neil Rackham in the late 70s was the 80-20 rule. 20% of the people were bringing in 80% of the sales. And each year, those top ones are getting promoted into management and failing as managers, just like I did. Right?
Do you think that's still true today? I mean, the 80-20?
Well, I thought it was until 2008, and then we had a speaker Greg Alexander from Sales Benchmark Index, and he said he had just done a survey of 1,100 B2B sales forces, and he said, guys, remember the 80-20 rule? Not anymore. It's 87-13. 13% of the salespeople brought in 87% of the revenue last year in 1,100 B2B sales forces.
So it got worse.
It got worse. And that caused me to flash back on a clue that my solution selling customers and CCS customers had been giving me for over 30 years that I never pursued hard enough.
And what was that?
The number one complaint I got from them was, Mike, the top 20% love it, but the bottom 80% quit using it within 2 weeks of the workshop. And so over the years, intellectual arrogance plus the nature of my customer. Remember, my customer was the former Mike Bosworth. They were all former star salespeople who got promoted into management because they could sell a ton. Right? But now they're in a position of management, and they realize that they sold intuitively. Right? Just like I eventually realized how intuitive I was back telling stories as a 28-year-old.
Right.
Because now I get why it worked.
Why it worked so well for the top percent?
Well, the top 13% of salespeople, they have the ability to connect with people, with other human beings, more easily and more intuitively.
Right.
Okay? They intuitively know how to use vulnerability. They intuitively know how to use self-deprecation. They intuitively know about suspense and plot and taking the time to roll out a story. Basically, they are doing intuitively what we have now figured out a way to teach the bottom 87% who don't do it intuitively how to connect, using storytelling, using some story building techniques. We have to give them a framework for how do you know you have all the elements of a good story, and then we have to help them practice delivering it and figuring out in what situations would you have to be able to do that in 20 seconds, and what situations could you buy yourself 90 seconds to tell that story, and under what conditions would it be where you could take 10, 15 minutes and roll out that story.
So you were doing this customer-centric program, and then you said you had a couple of very painful moments.
The one was 87-13.
Okay.
And because I realized that my efforts for the past 30 years, and if you think about it, all the efforts of the whole sales productivity industry. There wasn't just Mike Bosworth and solution selling out there. There was Miller Hyman and power-based selling and the complex sale and Wilson Learning and all these companies and all the CRM system companies, Siebel Systems and Salesforce.com now. Despite all of that sales productivity improvement effort, the best got better and the worst got worse. Right? So that's a wake-up call.
So why aren't sales teams smaller? I mean, at least at that point in time, if 13 are producing 87, why do they continue to have large sales teams where 87% of the team is underperforming?
Well, one, there's supply and demand. And I think that 13% goes way beyond the sales profession. Now, the reason we can measure it is that sales is so measurable. Where you can't measure teachers that way, or you can't measure psychologists that way, or you can't measure, I don't know, you pick, yeah. And at least there's no quantitative way to measure it the way there is in sales. But in virtually across all those lawyers, across all those professions, I believe that the same intuitive ability to connect and build trust quickly is what separates not only the best salespeople, but the best teachers and the best lawyers and the best politicians.
And what was it that made you realize, oh, I know what it is, stories?
Well, I just had a good karma, I had bad karma that year too. It was actually very shocking for me to learn the truth, but it was good for me to decide, all right, I'm going to leave that sales process world aside. And it's like I thought of Columbus leaving the shore, saying, well, there's some unknowns out there, but I'm going to go for it, and I'm, going to leave the sight of that shore. And I kind of do the same thing with the sales process world. I got introduced to a guy who had spent years in high tech, and he was in his late 30s, and he made a bunch of money, and he decided to take a sabbatical, and he moved to New York, and he spent 2 years getting his master's degree in applied mythology, the power of story. And then he went out and he started calling on all these sales training companies and saying to them, you need to start using storytelling in your methodologies. And how did you think most of them reacted to being told what they needed to do?
Nope.
No, sir. No. But when he called me, I was able to get past that because I knew he was just falling victim to probably the number one problem in sales, which is the salesperson telling the buyer what they need to do. Mm-hmm. And the ironic thing about that is there's a curve, and this is one of the great things Neil Rackham helped us discover at Xerox. And in Xerox, it was 18 months. Every company has its own performance curve, and if you hire people with different ages and different backgrounds, then you have no performance curve other than person hired into sales and when they make their first sale. But back then at Xerox, they had batches of kids coming in out of college, top 10% kids. And they'd watch them, and they'd get better and better and better from the day to hire. But at 18 months, you could set your watch by it as a class. Their performance would drop, shortly followed by morale. And the short answer, but it was not obvious to anyone. It really took Neil Rackham to figure it out. The short answer is in those 18 months, those salespeople became experts. They became experts at knowing every combination and permutation of buyer problem that lined up with their product.
So they started telling people what to do.
That's right. So within 4 seconds of meeting something, they go, oh, here's why you're having trouble with that, Nick.
Cut them off.
This is out of whack, this is out of whack, this is out of... We see it all the time. Here's what you need. Happen to have it right here. Let's do business.
And then
they go, yeah.
Easy.
Yeah, it's just like, if you come on to a girl too hard in a bar, right? They go, easy. Yeah. Same,
Yeah,
right?
Totally.
Yeah, so anyway...
so you came across this idea of telling stories and incorporating that into sales training.
Well, that's when I realized, because I realized I learned everything that I've been able to teach. We have a category of stories in our Story Seekers workshop called Personal Lessons Learned. And in my workshops, I probably tell dozens of personal lessons learned stories over the years about I had a customer who thought this way and a prospect who did this, and I had a boss who was like this, and I had a negotiation session that was like this, and so it really, it took me until 2008, though, to be able to put a conscious framework, an on-purpose framework around all those stories that I'd just been telling intuitively. Mm-hmm. In other words, when I came up with a framework, I had to figure out how to eat my own dog food, right, and make sure that the framework worked for me, because if it didn't work for me, I couldn't sell it to anybody else. Right. And so I now... have a lot more fun telling some of those stories because I'm much more conscious about some of the story building and telling tips that I've learned in building this workshop over the past 2.5 years.
Right.
So the only thing that can beat an unconscious competent out there is a conscious competent.
What do you mean by that?
Meaning that typically, we'd say the top 13% of sales forces, the ones bringing in 87% of the business, we'd label them unconscious competence. In other words, they're really good, but they don't have any on purpose in what they're doing. They're just doing it intuitively, and it works.
Got it.
They're in their groove, and it works.
Got it. Okay.
Right. But with those people, they love my new workshop even more than the regular guys
The
do.
conscious competent.
Well, no, they like it. No, the unconscious competence.
That's the goal, right? To become a conscious competent.
Exactly. As a manager. And see, they're in positions of management now, but they still realize that they're unconscious competence. Mm-hmm. And now I'm handing them a framework for coaching those bottom 87% that they were never able to coach before.
Right.
They did not know how to coach the people on their payroll who didn't do it intuitively. And a lot of them, especially when you get into high tech, are guys who are master's degrees and double E and chemical engineers. I mean, we've got some really highly left-brain people out there who are really trustworthy and really competent, but they struggle with connection. Mm-hmm. It's like if you want a picture of this, if your school is big enough to have an engineering cafeteria, just go have lunch in the engineering cafeteria someday and hang out with those guys, and you'll know that they need a framework for connection.
And that's telling a story.
And that is building a story with a certain framework.
Got it.
Not only facts and figures and people, but visual images and emotions and suspense and humor and metaphor.
And so why does that work?
Well, these are the things that the top 13% are doing intuitively. It's just so fun now because I can watch really good salespeople and I can take piece. Oh, he's doing this part of the model. He's doing this part of the model. So it's so fun for me to watch now because I can actually see it happening in real time.
But isn't there some kind of connection between telling a story and sort of our genes and how people learn to communicate that?
Yeah, biologically.
It works so
well. We are biologically programmed to connect. You're absolutely right. And two-legged creatures that speak language have been around. I've had opinions ranging from 100,000 years to a UCSD anthropologist who said 190,000 years. But, a big range where two-legged creatures were here and there was no written language. Everything they learned about friends, enemies, culture, spices, and everything was oral. It was all stories. And there's this University of Virginia business professor, Jean Ledka. I've never heard her pronounce her name, but she says in her class that stories were invented for two purposes: to pass on tribal knowledge and to influence people to do difficult things that needed to be done.
Very cool.
That second one's interesting. It's pretty specific.
It's very specific. And if you think about what salesmen are able to do, top salespeople are able to influence other people to do difficult things that need to be done, even though they don't have any authority over them.
Sure.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
But the problem in corporations is now we promote these influential salespeople into management, and the first problem is they now have to start counting all these things they hate counting, right? But they don't know how to teach people to influence, even though they were able to influence, and they end up telling people what they need to do. They get into a position where they can't coach the majority of the people on their payroll. But once they go through the workshop, they become conscious competence. And so I guess what I'm saying is if you ever want to be an effective sales manager or sales executive, you've got to be a conscious competent. That's how the top 13% of the sales force are unconscious competence. Now we're trying to get the next group down, maybe the next 50%, to become consciously competent, but they will still never be as good is that top 13% if they become consciously competent, because they're going to just bring it up again, right? And I believe that in sales, there's probably only 2% conscious competence. When you get into management, I think the higher up they make it, it's because of their ability to become consciously competent.
Interesting.
I think first-line managers aren't very consciously competent. And the ones that finally do become second-line managers, and I mean, even if you look in pro sports, the best managers are the people who needed to learn the X's and the O's. They couldn't make it on pure genius talent like LeBron or Michael Jordan or Kevin Durant, you know.
And I did take your workshop, and it was a life-changing experience. We just lost a camera.
Oh.
My worst nightmare.
Oh, man.
It's okay.
Yeah, it could be worse.
We'll spin this one around.
All right.
Hopefully this works.
Take
But
it, Nick.
We're almost out of time, so it's not a big deal. But can you give a quick sort of outline of how you make a good story? I know you have a card system, and it's not even going to do it justice to talk about it in a couple minutes, but at least it can give people an idea of what they would expect if they were to get your book or take your workshop.
All right. Well, the card system has 5 colors. 4 of them are in an arc, and one of them's hanging out there by itself. The one that's hanging out there by itself is the yellow card, and that's the why. That's the point of the story. What would we want the listener of this story to conclude or learn? And ideally, you know, we have people write that why on a card,
Okay.
and if they really tell the story well, it typically doesn't need to be verbalized.
Right.
Now, the story arc, we built it watching Hollywood screenwriters, and all movies have this arc. They start off with a setting, our green card, the setting where you're introduced to the characters, and you see their quirks, and you start to like both the characters. Let's just think of a chick flick, right? So that's the setting. You see where they live. You see that one of them likes music, and one of them likes to go-karting on the weekends. And, you know, you just get into their character and their sense of humor and who they are, right?
Sure.
Then you get to the complications and all the things that go wrong where you think, oh, God, these guys are never, ever going to get together again. I couldn't even anticipate more bad things happening, and all these bad things keep happening, and you see all the hysteria and the anger and all the emotions, and then finally the turning point, the insight, the aha moment, the blue card, where all of a sudden it's New Year's Eve on top of the Empire State Building, and they run into each other, right? You know, and then the resolution, the red card, you see 1 year later, and they're pushing their little baby carriage, you know, through the park.
Baby.
Yeah. So, basically, that story arc needs to be in all stories. And so, in a business story about yourself or your company or people you've helped, you still have a setting. You still have struggle. Stories aren't interesting unless they have characters, and those characters have to struggle. And then the turning point, the blue card, is when they get the aha moment, the insight, the new knowledge, the thing they never understood before. And the resolution is, if you're selling something, it's a year later, and they've been able to lower their inventory and eliminate shortages at the same time.
Right. And the complication piece where they have problems, why is that so important? And is that the vulnerability that's tied to the vulnerability aspect?
Well, I think when you're telling the story personally in the first person, your who I am story, it's definitely have to be some vulnerability in there. But when you're telling the story of your company, it's still good for your company to have realized that it missed a market and it took too long to respond to customers back in 98 and 99, but we learned from our mistake and we decided we're never going to do that again. In other words, some humanness in the company story as well.
So the vulnerability is what makes the story human.
Real, yeah, emotional. It's the emotional connection, because people make emotional decisions for logical reasons. They first decide emotionally what they want to do, and then they take their left brain out and start coming up with logical reasons so they can tell all their friends and their superiors.
Justification.
We all want to be perceived as sane
Right.
by other people.
I'm doing this because of this,
Right.
and this, and this, and this.
But not the real reasons.
No.
Right.
Yeah, I remember that was one of the coolest things I think I learned from your workshop, was showing vulnerability and how powerful that is to connecting with people. And it totally makes sense, because the people that don't show vulnerability and always try to act like their life's perfect
Right.
and they're in the best shape possible and they're dating this amazing woman and everything's perfect, you can't connect to those people because that's not what's actually going on in your own life.
No.
Like talking to I like talking to people that also have things that are screwed up because I do, and then you can talk about it and relate.
And I don't think that's what's going on in their life either, because I mean, what you painted was a perfect picture, but we all know it's not. And if you don't show that there's a chink in the armor, it's just super hard to relate to people like that.
I call them potholes, and every human being hits potholes.
Yeah.
Right.
It's now, what do you do after you hit that pothole? And if that's part of your story, now you're human.
Check the alignment.
Yeah, check the alignment. Maybe go get a little therapy and check the alignment.
Yeah.
And then, and Mike, what about story tending? How can you give us just some kind of an overview of how that works and why it works?
Well, from 2008 to 2010, we were focusing on building and telling stories, and we were having really good workshops for doing that, but we realized we hadn't cracked the connection code. And luckily for me, my long-term relationship, and I got married a year ago, was with a behavioral therapist, a couples therapist. And she helped figure out the story tending part. In other words, what we really want to do, you're not going to get a real connection until your buyer shares their story with you. Right? So if you were meeting a total stranger and all you knew, let's say you're at a trade show. And let's go back to my Xerox example. I'm at a trade show. A guy comes up and I see his name's, Nick Wetta, and he's a materials manager. And I say, oh, materials manager. Can I share a quick story with you about a materials manager we've been working with? They always say yes. That buys you 90 seconds. So in the workshop, we make sure they can deliver the Who I've Helped story in a maximum of 90 seconds. Because then they pass the torch. Enough about me, Nick, tell me about you. If that story worked, that person's going to start talking freely and sharing their story. And now's where the tending comes in. It would be just like learning techniques that therapists learn in therapy school about how to pull that story out and really get to the underlying why the buyer has. Because people make emotional decisions for logical reasons. And so until we know our buyer's emotional story, we're not really connected. So we tend that story, might go 30 to 45 minutes. Then at the end of that call, we summarize the buyer's story in 90 seconds and say, all right, do I get you?
So you repeat it back
to them.
Okay.
And the buyer corrects you or doesn't, but usually they say, yes, you get me. And then we teach them to say, and when I get back to the office, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to recollect that story and put it in writing for you just to make sure I got it right. Let me email it to you, and then please correct it, mark it up, because I'd like to have a written copy of your story accurately. And the buyer says, okay. And so 3 hours later, they get that story, and let's just say you got it right because you were really listening well that day. Mm-hmm. What do you think they're going to do with that story? Share it internally with all the people who will be part of any decision to buy whatever you're selling.
Right.
Okay, so it's called tribe building, and Seth Godin has a book out now on tribes. But the way new ideas get sold in enterprises is somebody needs to be that tribe leader. And so the best way you can manufacture, if you will, your own tribe leader for your product or your service in their company is to tend their story, get it right, put it in writing for them. Because now you've given them their script for their story.
You've done the work for them.
You've honed it, and you've put the arc in it, and you've made it so they can tell it to other people.
Right.
That's really interesting.
Because you write it from the cards. Mm-hmm. So in essence, you're giving them their story. They don't see the yellow and the green and the white and the blue and the red, but you've got a little paragraph in that letter for every card in their story. And so actually in the next workshop, remember the placemat that you had for building and telling stories? Mm-hmm. We're going to have you flip that over when it's time to tend the story, and it's going to give you some ideas for asking the right questions at each step in the buyer's story to make sure you get all the pieces.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's very cool. Okay, and how about, I'd kind of like to end it on a good story because we're kind of wrapping up, but can you give an example? You've done a lot of workshops of an example of someone that took your workshop and applied this storytelling concept in their personal life.
Oh.
Because I definitely saw a lot of people in our workshop were coming back after the first, second day, and we're like, wow, I had these huge aha moments with my family using this.
Yeah, you don't have to give names, but an example of a real life application.
The best application I can tell you is that we were doing a class for 30 people at a U for a $6 million technology company that had been purchased by a $2 billion East Coast company.
Okay.
All right? And when this startup was purchased, somehow they let the CEO go. Maybe he just took his money and left because he was tired of it, whatever. So it ended up the big East Coast multi-billion-dollar company installed a new CEO out in this company that had been grown by the founder.
Got it.
18 months later, everybody hates him. And the reason I knew it is at the U, every day for the first 2 days, anytime there'd be a break or lunch, it was like he had a force field around him. Nobody'd go near him. He had no connected relationships with anybody else in the room. He's like he was on an island. Mm-hmm. All right. The homework assignment the second night was to go tend somebody else's story. Doesn't have to be business. Could be personal. Friend, whatever. Tend somebody else's story, but be prepared in 90 seconds tomorrow to stand up and summarize that person's story in 90 seconds or less with the rest of the class. And we hadn't even gotten around to that assignment yet, but on the third morning, I'm going around the room asking everybody any aha moments from yesterday. And got around to the CEO, and he said, well, I travel 60% of the time. Besides this company, I've also got this other company. They're having me be CEO, too, so I've got two. I got divorced 4 years ago, and my biggest pain in my life right now is that my now 16-year-old daughter, she was 12 when we got divorced, my relationship with her is almost down to zero, and it's hugely painful. And so I decided I was going to try and tend her story last night. And typically when I call home every single night I'm on the road. He said, I call her. I don't call home. He's divorced. He calls his daughter every night. Usually it's a 60 to 90 second conversation. How are you? Fine. What did you do today? Went to school. Anything else? Oh, yeah, I went to work. One-word answers. Bye. He said, last night I sensed some vulnerability. And I decided I was going to do whole brain listening, the Chinese symbol for listening, complete attention, all channels open to her. And I said, what's going on, baby? It sounds like something's wrong. And she started revealing just a little bit. And I started tending that story. I was on the phone with her for 45 minutes. And I haven't been that connected to her since she was 12.
Wow.
That's a nice story, right?
Yeah.
Gets better. At the next break, now all these people in the room are giving him hugs.
That's awesome.
It's that one piece of vulnerability.
He told, when we do leadership classes, one of the stories leaders need is an I am human story. And if you're leading people for multiple years, you're going to have to keep writing repeated I am human stories. They need to hear new ones every time you stand up in front of the company. But those are huge at facilitating connection, because if you're the senior or the salesperson, you'll recall in the sale, what do we say about vulnerability in the workshop? If you're in sales or if you're in leadership, you got to go first.
Right.
And if you go first, the rules of emotional reciprocity will hold. And if you reveal something at a vulnerable level, your listener will respond at that level.
Right.
If you tell a I'm so smart, I'm so great story, you're going to get an I'm so smart, I'm so great story from them.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's like if someone tells you some really deep, passionate story about their family, you feel comfortable sharing that same level of a story about your own life.
Right.
And you notice that in conversation. I mean, when people do share stories, whether it's about something they've done or somewhere they've gone, it's almost like the other person is thinking to themselves, oh, I've got a story about that too. Let me wait till he's done and then I'll tell mine. I mean, you notice it right away.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah. And that's why that 90-second Who I've Helped story, this is to a stranger, if it really is a knowledgeable story, pure story. So if you're a CEO, I'm telling you a CEO story. If you're a VP of marketing, I'm telling you a VP of marketing story, ideally in the same industry.
Right.
Automotive or multi-location retail or whatever. The more targeted that can be, and then after maximum of 90 seconds, because this story has beef in it. In other words, you've plotted this story out, so it's got all the elements to where it can really hit hard emotionally in 90 seconds. And then you say, enough about me, tell me what's going on with you. Off they go. And now you tend that story for 30 to 40 minutes, summarize it back, put it in a letter.
That's awesome.
Wonderful things can happen.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. And like I said, I went through it and have experienced it. It's really powerful.
Do we have time for one more story?
Of course we do. Yeah.
Everything's going to die.
A salesperson from your company who went after you.
Right.
I don't think I should use his name, so I won't. But anyway, when we talked about that performance curve where your expertise ends up becoming your enemy and you just get so excited, you calculate the commission. I know what you need. Here's what you need.
Right, after 18 months.
Right, yeah, whatever. And he knew in the class, he came up to me the next break and he says, that's me. I've been doing that. And he said he was in a slump. Mm-hmm. The day after the workshop, he called me and he said he'd been on 3 different sales calls where he was about to tell them what they needed to do, and he caught himself and consciously told a Who I've Helped story.
Right.
It turned into 3 sales.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can attest to that.
Yeah, well, that can end a slump.
Yeah. Definitely.
The best way to end a slump is to sell something.
I think it's the only way.
Or maybe a hit if you're in baseball, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe a girl, in Nick's case.
Yeah, in Nick's case.
Oh, guys.
Nick's going out and he's telling people he's Adam Levine and he's getting away with it.
Well,
all he needs is a few more tats.
I'm Adam Levine. All right, well, you're married and you have a girlfriend. I'm the single one here, so let's move on. We're basically done. We've run out of time. We didn't really run out of time, but my camera's dying.
Oh, that's a good reason.
But
it means Jesus is telling us this is over.
Yeah.
Exactly. The production and everything is going to get a lot smoother. There's not that many resources out there about how to set this stuff up. So me and Pete are learning slowly. So for our audience, just hang in there with us. And then thanks a lot, Mike. That was a really good conversation. And I would suggest people to definitely read his latest book, which is What Great Salespeople Do. And then also you have a lot of private workshops for companies, but occasionally public ones too that people can join.
There's one, I don't know if this interview will get out in time, but there's one in early October in Carmel, California.
Okay.
October 8, 9, and 10.
And where can people go to learn more about these workshops?
MikeBosworth.com.
Yes.
Very cool. And we have a Facebook page. Follow us. It's facebook.com/storyjunkie.
Yeah, we just got our Facebook page up,
all right.
and there's information on that, and then we'll be on YouTube, iTunes, and our website will be up next week also. So.
All right. We'll follow you if you follow me.
All right, deal.
All right, deal.
All right, thanks,
all right.
Mike.
Thank you.